Second.
Any discussion?
Oh, wait, minutes? There is one change Polly brought to my attention. It's on page 3.
Oh, yeah. Also, there's a couple of little grammar things, so we need to do that.
Yeah, I can make those adjustments for one more page.
Okay.
On page 3, for 7.1.5 landscaping, I said, Bill said caliber is a device to measure diameter of the tree. Polly pointed out that she said that it, Polly said that that should be her on there instead of Bill. So that's the only change I have.
I missed that meeting, so I will be abstaining, and my screen just changed.
Yeah, Barbara, your screen sharing.
I am. Sorry, I messed up. So I should stop that?
Yeah.
There we go.
Hold on, let me.
I got a bunch of stuff up here.
All right.
Okay.
So that's the only change I had. Only change I wanted to know.
I wasn't at the meeting either, so I don't have an opinion on the minutes.
So do we have enough people to pass the minutes without everyone voting?
There's 6 people attending.
So you have 4 people.
Well, she can vote to, she can vote to approve even if she wasn't there.
So do we want to make a motion?
Yeah.
Make a motion to approve the minutes?
Second.
All in favor? Are we supposed to do it all in favor?
Better tell George out loud.
Do we have a motion to accept the minutes?
Yes, I did.
I'll make the motion.
Okay, all in favor who aren't abstaining?
Aye.
Aye.
Sounds like the majority of what I hope is a quorum approves the minutes, minutes of the last meeting.
All right, good.
At which point, I guess we turn the meeting over to the presenter.
All right, we'll start with, we're going to do Article 8, Environmental Standards. And as we've done in the past, we'll go through section by section. So the first subsection is Stormwater Management, which is 8.1. And we'll just accept comments. This allows, just very briefly, there's 3 options you can use to meet the standards. If your stormwater plan is required by the Department of Environmental Protection as per Chapter 500, we accept that plan. Or you would do a stormwater plan that's compliant with the Maine DEP Stormwater Management for Maine Best Management Practices. Or you could use the Maine LID guidance for stormwater, which is designed for residential and multifamily residential and small commercial. So any one of those options could be used to meet the stormwater standards.
Bill, can I ask a question? How do I signal I'm going to ask a question? Do I just talk?
You can just ask, yes.
So, Bill, what triggers the, what does it mean by new development? I mean, what triggers a stormwater management plan?
Well, it's any new development.
Anything?
Anything, yeah.
House
Yeah,
going
any
up or-
development that obviously impacts, opening up the soil, creating impervious surface.
Okay.
And that would include just a single family dwelling or, yes.
This is likely to come up.
Pardon me? I'm sorry, George, I didn't hear you.
So anytime there's an impervious surface change, this is going to become a topic of the planning board meeting.
Or the CEO?
Well, it would depend on how the use chart says it's going to be reviewed.
Okay. This is partly my confession, but also I think it would be a good thing to do. Can you characterize anything that's different about this as we go forward compared to what's always been in the book?
Well, what we've done is that we've allowed in the ordinance now 3 different ways of meeting the stormwater standards. So if someone comes in and is required to have get a stormwater permit from Site Location Act or because of the size of development under the stormwater law, that plan we would accept as being compliant. Or if it's a larger development, they would use the BMP models in the manual. And we also allow for smaller developments, the LID, low impact development standards, which are much easier to use. You don't need an engineer to use those. And they're designed for residential and multifamily and also small commercial. So if you have a commercial operation that doesn't trigger the Chapter 500 stormwater standards at DEP, they can use these LID standards. So it gives them a lot more flexibility.
What would be an example of something that would trigger the higher standard?
Oh, it's something like a larger scale development over like 20,000 square feet of impervious area, just as an example.
But, well, let me ask you differently. Is it clear to the planning board or whoever is making the approval that it's not a matter of judgment, it's some dimension or some number or some fairly...
Yeah, the options are, there's guidance as to...
Precise difference.
Yeah, there is, the options spell out what standard you would have to use, yeah.
Okay, so there's no vagueness about that?
No.
Okay, so then if I heard you right, the biggest difference is that there's now 3 ways to become acceptable, and perhaps before there was just 1.
That's correct, yeah.
What does LID, low impact, mean, Bill?
It's a low impact development. We'll send out the manual for that to everyone so they can take a look at it. Max, did I give you the website for that? If not, I'll get it to you tomorrow. And Max will send that out. It's not a large document, but you could see by it, it's basically you choose from a menu of options, and it's easier to use for small scale developments.
Okay.
Just one small edit.
Sure.
8.1.1.2, second sentence. Stormwater plan shall be designed.
Yep.
Yeah, also 8.1.1, stormwater plan options, a stormwater management, and shouldn't say a stormwater management plan, shall conform.
Sure.
I can't hear whoever's talking.
I'm probably too far away. Am I?
Do you have a mic there, Polly, or?
I forgot
No, I can
to set these up.
talk like, oh,
What section are you
help is
talking?
coming.
How much this is gonna do for you?
Okay, 8.1, Barbara. A stormwater management, and it should say plan shall conform.
All right,
Yeah, we're just gonna add the word, yep.
true.
Yep. Is there any other questions or comments or?
On, just as a small point, but 8.1.1.2, you have 2, 10, and 25-year frequencies, and I think the
Right,
2 hyphens should also say year, 10-year, or dash year, and 25 year. That's very hard to read.
we can add that in.
So 2-year, 10-year, 25-year?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the next one, 8.1.13. Non-residential and multifamily uses are smaller developments
Yep,
with an S.
plural, yeah.
And 8.1.3, second line, professional certified by the
Yes.
Maine, yeah,
Maine
Yeah.
Department.
not Maine, state of.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments, revisions, changes? Hearing none?
I think this is pretty standard for a knowledgeable civil engineer. I don't think anything here is unusual.
No, this is pretty,
Going to page 2,
yep,
um,
The
item
LID
4.
is basically, it's kind of a brochure brochure of suggestions, right? There's nothing legal about that as a document, is there?
Yes, we are going to reference it as the standard that they would use. The state of Maine has adopted it, so.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it is a legal,
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we're going to have in the ordinance, we'll have these referenced so that you can go online and get the copies, and we'll have physical copies at the town office also.
okay,
But all of these you can access online.
right.
Anyway, on item 4 at the top of page 2, time of concentration flow paths, what does time mean?
Time of concentration?
Oh, duration?
Right, what they measure is whether you have sheet flow or if it's flowing in a ditch, you're interested in the time of concentration that a particular storm event occurs and that.
7 hours,
Yeah,
whatever.
and that's based on the 10, 20, 5, 10, and 25-year.
Duration might be clearer. I don't know.
Let me check, because we typically call it time of concentration, but let me just
Well, I
check.
mean, that may be in the trade.
Yeah, let me
That's
check the, just nomenclature on that.
Yeah, I mean,
Is our language basically taken from somebody else's who already has used it?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, this is something that it should be in our current ordinance. I'll just check to see if duration's something that we could substitute without changing the meaning, that's all.
Duration really means how long something will last. It's more,
Yeah,
it's
but
like it's more technical.
I know, but
They already use
it does have a technical definition,
Yeah.
that's why.
well, a layperson reading this,
Well, this is not designed, this is something, if you're doing this would be something an engineer would do. Because it refers to the engineer requirement for if it's a subdivision, it requires a PE to design
okay.
it, yeah.
So are we ready to move to the next one?
That would be erosion control. I just want to alert.
Let me just ask my standard question. How is it, or is it substantially different from what we have now?
We're just clarifying a few things. One is that we're referencing the Maine Erosion Sedimentation Control Handbook for Construction, BMPs, as a reference guide for designing your erosion control measures. And then when you do develop one, from 1 to 12, it tells you the items you need to address. And
Is erosion control just during construction, or is it?
no, erosion control does two things. One is during construction, where soil is disturbed, and you also have to specify your permanent measures, planting grass or whatever.
So it's beyond just the construction phase?
That's correct. Yeah. And that's where the BMP manual discusses that. And that's another document that we'll reference so people can go online and look at it, and then we'll have a copy here in the office also.
So the paragraph we just worked on to do with stormwater, I assume these dovetail together so that whatever comes out of your stormwater doesn't erode? Is that just part of the overall design approach?
Well, the erosion control is really, the first part of the erosion control deals with, the temporary on-site construction to limit the flow, and then the stormwater control and the permanent erosion control measures meld together, actually. That's where where they dovetail and work together.
Okay, all right.
And again, the complexity of your erosion control is going to depend on the type of development. Typically, somebody putting in a home, it's going to be fairly simple. Obviously, if you have a large development or development near a water body, river, stream, wetland, there'll be other issues that they would have to deal with.
Is it up to the planning board to determine how much you spend on your plan?
No, it's not a matter of spend.
I'm back to that. When is it an arbitrary, feel like an arbitrary burden, and when is it just right there in front of you, you gotta do it?
Well, I think as most of it's there in front of you. That's where you use the BMP manual. The BMP manual's designed to you would choose a management or a particular practice based on your environmental circumstances, the lay of the land, et cetera. So your choices are made really based on where you're developing, et cetera.
But it does fall to the planning board to keep asking questions until they're satisfied on these fairly technical issues.
Yeah, most of the time, we're gonna ask the code officer to review this, because this is really, he would be the point person with the most training to determine,
Well, it says at the beginning, it shall require a written soil erosion.
That's right, yeah.
Nation control plan, so that could be quite informal, right?
Yeah, that would be, usually for smaller, project, that's gonna be baked into the permit. When they draw their plan, say they're building a house, they're going to draw their site plan, and then they'll indicate where they're gonna put their erosion control, whether it's typically for silt fencing, hay bales, or mulch, and then what permanent measures they'll put. They're gonna plant it in grass or whatever. So some of this is pretty simple. It's only when you get into large-scale developments, sometimes that it gets a little more complicated, but. I think what we're doing is we're emphasizing that whenever we're disturbing soil for construction, we have to address erosion control.
The topography would be a tremendous
Oh, yeah.
impact on this.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
that's why it's gonna be situational. That's why
Yeah.
I'm trying to save the planning board from becoming the bad guy because it's a steep hill.
In the BMP manual, for each, like if you're gonna use silt fencing or hay bales or something, there's a matrix there that tells you what are the conditions where that BMP is suitable. So you pick from that particular chart.
Okay. I leave it to you to move forward when you think we should.
Yep, all right. Hydrologic assessment of groundwater impacts. This section is remained unchanged from the existing ordinance. We didn't make any changes in that at all.
Does that get into whether your well impacts somebody else's well?
No, what triggers it is in the a groundwater impact is required for projects that involve on-site water supply or surge disposal facilities with a cumulative capacity of 2,000 gallons or more per day. So if you're taking 2,000 gallons of water out of the ground, or if you have a subsurface system that's 2,000 more, then it would trigger this study.
So if you had an existing well that you were going to increase the use of, does that get surfaced at that point, or?
Only if you reach the 2,000 gallon threshold. Same thing with, go ahead.
Is there a norm, is there an assumed usage for a single-family dwelling?
Yeah, for like a 2-bedroom house, it's probably 200 gallons per day. 3-bedroom, it would be like 270.
You're talking about something bigger than a single-family dwelling. Okay, yeah.
The 2,000 gallon, at least for the surge disposal, dovetails with the plumbing code. If there's a system that is more than 2,000 gallons per day, that has to be an engineered system. That's not something that a soil evaluator can design, unless we would need.
There's an example of that in the folks who are trying to grow eels in Walterboro. They went through all those hoops.
Oh, right, yeah. I'm sorry.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Single family house, you said it uses 200 to 300
Well,
a day?
for a 2-bedroom, it's 180 to 200, and for a 3-bedroom, it's 270. So that wouldn't trigger this assessment at all on that. So is there any questions on the hydrologic assessment? this doesn't get triggered very often.
Is there any formal language anywhere that we're going to be coming up against that gets into when person A starts using more water and person B well starts to fail? Is that anywhere?
Again, the only thing that would trigger that is that if we're over that threshold of 2,000 gallons, yeah. The only thing, George.
Everybody's dealing in relatively small gallons.
Yeah.
There's no attempt to cast.
The only time that does come into play, George, when there's a subdivision, and they're going to use wells, we do ask that they provide evidence from a well driller or a hydrologist that the new subdivision will not impact the existing wells in use in the area. That's the only time where we...
To the extent that it might be instructive, when they were doing a flow test on the well for the eel farm, they did monitor nearby wells to verify that there was no of any significance at all, if any. So it is part of what engineering plans do, is actually check out the wells.
And a lot depends on again, how much draw they're going to take from the groundwater. This has come up in other towns when, like Nestle would come in for water extraction for bottled water. I mean, that's the typical.
Bill, if I could ask, you said it's 8.3 is not changing at all from the original. Can you orient me where the heck it is in the original? I'm looking through Article 8.
It's probably,
Article 4.
it's in Article 4?
Article 4, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should be Article 4, and it's by alphabetical order.
Yeah, what we did is in this version, we're pulling out all the environmental items and putting them together.
Okay.
Yeah.
I apologize.
That's all right.
Listening to meetings, so I'm behind. Okay.
I'm just going to move on if there's no other questions. On 8.4, this is water quality impacts. Again, all the language here is it comes from our existing ordinance. We just clustered it together. Most of this is kind of generic standards for no activity shall locate, store, discharge anything that would create harm to the environment or neighboring properties. And also for storage facilities, it requires the impoundment areas for above ground storage tanks, fuel tanks, and it exempts storage tanks for home heating oil and diesel fuel not exceeding 275 gallons in size. This mirrors the requirements from this above ground storage tanks are regulated now, not by DEP, but the Fire Marshal's office, and this requirement mirrors that.
This is oil storage or what?
Any kind of fuel, diesel, any petroleum product, yeah.
And which number is this?
This is 8.4.2.
Does this interface with the wellhead protection areas in any significant way?
Oh, that's a separate, those are separate standards, yeah.
We'll come to that later.
Yeah, we're not touching that standard.
Okay.
So that's just those two areas up where you're located, George.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then below ground tanks, we just have a reference there. Anything below the ground is regulated by DEP. So that they handle, you have to get permitted for that, and they inspect that.
Do we know what buried tanks there are in town?
Actually, DEP has, over the years, particularly with regard to petroleum, diesel fuel, they have made an effort to document where they are because periodically they need to be tested and replaced. So that's an ongoing issue with them. Every once in a while, a stray one shows up that we didn't know was there, but that incidence has been, going down as years go by.
Near Dunkin' Donuts, where there isn't a gas station anymore, I just wondered if those tanks were taken out.
Yeah, yeah, if a tank is abandoned, then they have to pull the tank.
Okay.
The only time they won't do it is, if it's going to be reused and it's still under its permit limitation. So there's X amount of years the tank could be in before it needs to be replaced, so.
Okay.
Are those mostly commercial, below ground?
Well, yes and no. We find them at schools, factories, large estates along the coast. A lot of times they would have buried tanks. Religious monasteries, convents,
Yeah.
large buildings like that had them. Then moving on, if there's nothing else, phosphorus control. We took phosphorus control right from the existing ordinance. Phosphorus control only is applicable to when you're adjacent to a great pond, or I should say in the watershed of a great pond.
And there's a statutory definition.
Yeah,
Great
oh,
pond.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
25 acres, I think, was it, something like that.
I think it's 10 acres or more.
10 acres?
I think, wait a minute, no, that's a wetland. I think it is 25, you're right, yeah.
So that if there's a smaller pond,
It won't be regulated.
Right.
They're actually listed here.
yeah, I can
Yeah,
see that,
yeah.
but this only protects great ponds, it
Right.
doesn't protect smaller bodies. Okay.
So does that relate to agricultural use of phosphorus in order?
It relates to any development that is adjacent in the watershed of a great pond, would have to follow the phosphorus loading standards.
Okay, so if someone has a house and they want to put fertilizer on it with phosphorus, it's up to them to find out if they can?
No, this would be, the phosphorus standards deal with development. So if you're putting in a home in the watershed of a great pond, then you would deal with these standards. But no, it doesn't necessarily deal with the use of phosphorus as a fertilizer on the land. This standard doesn't.
Yeah, there's lots of states that do, is why I was
I know,
asking.
yeah. No, the phosphorus control standards, as designed, are really just designed for when a development occurs in the watershed of the pond itself.
So conceivably, if somebody was putting a development in a watershed area, they would have to have a plan so that they weren't using agricultural or lawn care fertilizer with phosphorus?
No, what they would have to do is design their development so they meet the thresholds for loading. They would have to come under a certain standard. Most of the time, that means putting in buffer areas to stop the transfer of the phosphorus into the pond area.
Barbara, I think you were going to say something?
I was basically coming back to, this is all about lawns, right? Even development, any kind of lawn, but that landscape buffer area answers that question. But what precipitates, how do you evaluate so they have to come up with a landscape plan that shows buffers, and they're required to submit that type of plan?
Right. If it's in the watershed of a great pond, yes.
The Madomic Valley watershed, is that?
No, well, no, there's a chart of the ponds here, so you would have to be in the direct watershed of that pond.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we don't have anything like this for the river?
No, this is only germane to ponds. Phosphorus is an issue, not in the river, but it's an issue for the ponds. Nutrient loading from manure or whatever is a problem with the nitrogen is a problem with the river, but phosphorus is more acute for the pond areas.
Like China Lake, for example.
Madomic Pond, which feeds the Madomic River, is that?
Yeah, Madomic Pond is listed on the chart, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but we're only dealing with the watershed of the pond, not the stream or the river, yeah. That would be the limiting factor for the ponds, because that's what's gonna create, algae blooms, the degradation of oxygen in the water, et cetera.
So do we have a plan of the town that specifies what areas are watersheds?
Yes, we have watershed maps, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, where this is usually germane is when we do subdivisions, you know, if they're developing in the watershed of one of the ponds, that's what typically triggers the phosphorus plan. Occasionally a large development, but that doesn't happen too often.
On 8.5.3.
Yep.
Talks about existing septic system. Would it be a good idea to put in there, or is connected to the town wastewater disposal system?
8.5.3.
8.5.3.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know. I don't know, I just,
In this particular case, we're really just concerned with septic system.
right.
Yeah.
But if there is no septic system,
Well, then, if they're,
okay.
if they're,
That's, okay,
Yeah,
fine,
yeah.
yeah.
New development.
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm reading it too broadly.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, if they're hooked up to the public sewer, it's not an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it would seem to be obvious.
And then moving to 8.6, this is just a small indication for soils, just kind of a generic reference to soils.
Can you give an example of a severe soil?
Of a severe soil, yeah, that would be, in our area, it would probably be hydric soils, would be a severe type soil. In other parts of the state, you might have severely sandy soils, or soils with rock outcrop closer to the surface where there's very little vegetative matter. But for us, it would be predominantly hydric type soils. Those are, they're poor for drainage. They're poor for construction because they're very elastic type clayey soils. And they're prone to severe runoff. And then 8.7, air and water pollution. This is language we took, from the existing ordinance. It's kind of just general performance language. In most cases, we defer to DEP for any issues with air pollution or severe water pollution, but particularly air pollution. We just don't have the capacity to deal with that. I mean, a case in point would be in South Portland, the outgassing from the oil storage tanks might be an example, or smokestack emittance, from an industrial plant or something like that. We occasionally, this comes up with crematoriums also become an issue. Usually there's not an issue, a problem, but we sometimes we get complaints from the public from that. And then 8.8 is aesthetic, cultural, natural values. Again, this is just generic language. What we reference is features that we identified beginning with habitat maps, rare or replaceable natural areas, or public rights for physical. Yeah, here's my language issues, like with the caliper on that. And visual access to the shoreline. Usually, this comes into play, again, mostly when we do subdivisions. We'll refer with the beginning with habitat maps, and we look for special or endangered species or plants, things like that, and also for watershed features like wetlands, rivers, streams, brooks, things like that.
So other than historic sites, Waldoboro hasn't really set any other kind of scenic areas or aesthetic areas aside in any way, right?
No, that's correct. That's correct.
In
Yeah,
any way.
yeah. No, we don't have that. We don't have any scenic area protection, except for we require some scenic survey when we do we install like cell towers, things like that. But no, nothing else, Barbara.
So how does, that seems like it's there, but would be easily challenged if it came in front of the planning board.
Well, again, we reference, areas that are identified by Department of Inland Fishery or beginning with habitat. Beginning with habitat maps are usually our go-to documents. All of that information there is vetted by the Department of Inland Fishery and Wildlife that pertains to most of these issues. So if we identify it on that map, then that's something we could be cognizant of when we do in the development review. Like I said, most of the time, this is done mostly with subdivisions because there's specific review criteria that require these items to be looked at by the developer and identify them in their plans.
Yeah, but we slowly lose some of these places when it's piecemeal, piece by piece by piece. So we could, in fact, come up with a map that shows the beginning with habitat overlaid with historic as a start.
Well,
someplace.
Well, we already have that, Barbara.
Talk about 8.8, right?
Yeah, the habitat maps, we have we would refer to a couple of maps, but the information's right there. The only thing that we lack is we don't, the historic information, those are in separate documents. We have predictive archaeological maps that we have, and most of the time that occurs adjacent to or in waterways. And then we have inventory maps that deal with prehistoric and historic sites, or like historic homes. And then we also have pre-history sites. It could be, it could be something like old cellar holes or like shell midlands, things like that.
Are you saying
Is there anything to do with the town landing in town there, where it's both historic and we kind of like the way it looks?
No, not necessarily, no. The historic aspect would be if there's evidence that there's some archaeological value to some areas like, along the water, it could be an old Indian settlement or burial ground or something like that.
I think there's a sunken ship, a large sailboat,
Yeah.
partway down the river.
Yeah, that there is. If it's in, I'm not sure. We don't list those typically, although they could be listed. The state could list those.
In the Google Earth, there's a funny pointy piece of marsh which is apparently covering an old sailboat from came for repairs or something below the Friendship Street School area there.
Oh, all right.
Intern projects.
I'm sorry, Barbara. I didn't hear you, Barbara.
It would be a good intern project.
Actually, yeah. Actually, it would be interesting, not just Waldoboro, but to do along the coast, the immediate coast. There was a lot of shipbuilding done.
Okay, Pauline had a question?
I'm sorry.
On exactly that topic, I was wondering if there is any kind of that's kind of an interesting thing, when so many places are getting overbuilt. If we have all these little gems, but they're all different, from different disciplined, so to speak. You know, some of them are historic, some of them are scenic. But if those were all put together in one thing, like a map, with some explanation of them,
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting, particularly to people who are going to move into Waldeboro.
Yeah, well, actually, we have that information.
And is
That
it,
was in the comp plan. That was, all that data was put in the comprehensive plan. And so it is there. It is
Yeah.
there.
but I mean, there's no like.
There's no like master map like
Yeah.
that would advertise it. You're right, yeah.
Because that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, the Historical Society supposedly is one of the best attended places in town because it capsulizes all of these fascinating little things. And we used to live on Cape Cod, and it was the same thing. Any of those museums that were showing what it looked like in Provincetown and who got there was absolutely fascinating. And so it sort of pulls together what
What's there,
this
yeah.
town was
Yeah.
and what pieces are still left.
Yeah, that's something we don't have.
I think it would be a great idea.
I was just thinking that.
Maybe I
too.
should
Yeah.
volunteer.
And then moving on to the flood zone, this just refers to, you know, that if you're in the regulatory floodway, you have to meet the standards of the floodplain ordinance. Just keep in mind, we are pulling out the floodplain ordinance from the document, and it's going to be under separate cover. And the reason we're doing that is we get a model floodplain ordinance that's developed by FEMA, and it's structured much differently than our ordinance. And this way, it just, if we keep it as a separate document, when it does get updated, it's just easier to update that if it's kept separate. But it'll be referred to in the land use ordinance because we use it regularly. If development occurs, the code officer has to check the floodplain maps to make sure, you know, something isn't being developed in the floodplain. And if it is, then it has to meet specific standards.
Is this where you hear things like the 100-year flood?
Right, yeah, yeah.
And who makes that determination? It seems like 100-year floods are happening more and more often.
Well, we call it the regulatory floodplain, and the maps are made by the U.S. Geological Service with FEMA to identify what that means, and they do change over time. So we are, sea level rise, changes in weather patterns, you know, do affect, you know, the elevation, and will obviously affect the 100-year floodplain. So they are subject to change.
But this is also an impartial, we don't have to
No,
amend it sort of piece of information.
no, that it's done by the federal government. Yeah, we just
I
recently.
interrupted you again.
Oh, that's okay. So in that paragraph just describes structures that have to be set back.
That's correct.
What about septic systems?
Septic systems have a
Roadways?
yeah, they have
that
a
kind of thing.
yeah, that they're covered under the plumbing code, the subsurface waste disposal rules, and they have to be outside of the regulatory floodway. What's an issue, Barbara, is as this changes, particularly with sea level rise, that's going to impact, or it could impact, depending on where you're located, a number of existing subsurface systems. So over the next 50 years or 100 years, some of those systems are going to have to be brought further up out of the
They're not grandfathered?
No, well, they're not going to work if they're in the floodplain. You know, if they're inundated frequently, then, you know, they cease to function properly. So that's going to be a problem, you know, as in years
So if
ahead.
somebody's coming in and just bought some shorefront and they want to put in a project and they're looking through our ordinance, are they going to know that from reading this, that they can't put their septic system?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, the septic system's designed by a soil evaluator, and they're the ones that are the first people, you know, in their design, they're gonna keep it out of the, you know, the proper distance from the high water line and keep it out of the floodway, and then it gets inspected. by the plumbing inspector here.
Max, didn't we just have a project where the septic
I was about,
system was within the floodplain?
well, I was about to say, the Ice Pond subdivision amendment did have a map, but I believe the septics were outside of the shoreland and the flood zone. They made a point to make sure that was well within the allowable setbacks.
It was right on the line, you know, it's small scale map, but,
Or at least they said that this is where it would be. Obviously, when the septic does happen, Stan Waltz, the local plumbing inspector, still has to certify it.
Yeah,
yeah, they had two test pits done, and so there was an alternate spot, but, didn't get the impression from that meeting that anybody thought it had to be moved from the,
no, it can't,
one close to the floodplain.
they can't put the system in the floodplain, and it has to meet the minimum setback.
In the,
Right, so
go ahead.
just a comment. I once in a while, there are tricky issues here, but as a general rule, most builders now have these, since these rules have been around in different ways for a long time, most builders have identified the civil engineering talent that can deal with probably 90% of what's in this, Section 8 fairly expeditiously, because they do it all the time. They become very familiar. There are at times, obviously, like you're just talking, there can be a few ones that are dicey, that are challenging. But this is, whereas from the very beginning when these rules came out, people had problems with some of them, but it's been all absorbed. Max, Bill, you can disagree, but I think it's, for most builders and civil engineers, most of it's pretty pro forma.
Yeah, this is,
To the extent that it's possible that these floodplain lines could change as either weather patterns change or even the water level rises, is there any provision that accommodates something that was legal becoming not legal?
well, it's a matter of, it's not just a matter of legality, George. It's a matter of they will not function.
I guess that's the other way I should ask you.
Yeah.
Have we ever made anybody move a septic system because of floodplain?
No, we're not at that point. I think that's why I said looking forward, there's a lot of models out there of what we can expect as to the actual sea level rise. So, I mean, depending at what actually happens, that will dictate, how many systems will be in peril that will need to be moved.
Cross that bridge when we come to it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously, if, my advice would be is to move it back as far as possible. But that decision is, that's based on a lot of variables about getting the adequate soils for the system to operate, so.
But for new development, people should obviously understand factoring in your point and not try to get even close to, should factor in a reasonable sea level rise and then make sure that they're beyond it.
Yeah, the soil evaluators are up to speed on this. This is not, like you were saying, this is something that they're up in, they're in front of this. If there's nothing else, I'm just going to move on to river, stream, brook, and wetlands, and this is just a generic thing, and it's a requirement that any development identify any type of water body within your particular site or near your particular site. And that's where, again, the beginning with habitat maps are wonderful, because you could tell, they identify forested wetlands, emerging wetlands, wetlands with surface water, and obviously all types of streams. So we're alerted to if the proposed development will be in the proximity of some water body.
Is this the area where you sometimes hear about trading wetlands? You're going to fill something in, so you have to create a wetland? Is that where this appears?
Well, yeah, it depends. You first identify them. A lot of times, this is something that you would have to deal with DEP, and there's a tiered approach. There's a 3-phase tier. A permit by rule would be the the easiest one, and that would be if you're disturbing wetland less than or equal to 4,360 square feet. And then the second tier, I don't remember the exact threshold, but that does require a DEP permit. And then the third tier is the full NEPA permit, which is pretty involved. And that usually gets bumped up to the regional office for review at EPA. And that's where you would have the trading possibly as one of the mitigation factors. But that's all done by the state or the EPA for that. I mean, that does happen. And most of the time at our level, we deal with someone has to fill in a portion of a roadway or a bridge to get access. And so we're dealing with very small incursions to a wetland. And most of those are approved if they're done, if they're constructed properly and there's no other alternative. Those are usually the two factors. The last thing is 8.11. This is new. This is buffer requirements for water quality protection. And this specifies vegetative buffers. If you're adjacent to a wetland, water body of any sort, and your buffer size is dependent upon the average slope of land between the disturbed area and the normal high water mark, and the width of the buffer is specified based on that slope. So if you're adjacent to a water body and it's basically flat land, your buffer area is supposed to be 50 feet. And if it's a severe slope, 50%, 40%, you're dealing with like over 250 or possibly over 250 feet of buffer area. And the buffer could be.
As far as to say what you have to plant?
Well, the first thing is that you're encouraged to keep the natural buffer that's there, natural vegetation. And if it's not there, then you would have to plant. What we're looking for, it's very similar to shoreland zoning. We're looking for two things. The creation over time of a duff layer on the ground, if possible. And then the second would be over time, the creation of a tree canopy, which provides kind of a way of buffing or slowing the rainwater. And then when it hits the ground, if we have a thick duff layer, it stops the stormwater and erosion into the water body. But this is designed so that if you don't have a natural buffer or treat area that can be used, that you could plant, but we're giving it a 20-year window to develop a proper tree canopy.
Bill, I think that word duff layer is really important, and
oh, absolutely.
I see it in 8.11.2.3.
Yep.
It's the only place I see it, but I think that really helps people understand that that's different than a low lawn.
Right. In the buffer area
Do we
that.
define a duff layer anywhere so that there's no debate?
I'm sorry, George?
Do we define what a duff layer is? I think
Well,
it is, but
you're not gonna, if most vegetative buffers, unless it's an existed forested area where you'll have an existing duff area, but if you're planting, you're gonna have vegetation growing on that lower level. And initially it might be grasses. The duff layer will occur over a period of time. As your tree canopy grows, your leaf litter settles on the ground. So, I mean, it takes a considerable period of time for that to develop.
There's a surprising number of properties that are mowed down to the shore edge in town.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
What does this provide a tool for?
Well, it does give us some, this would give us some for us to be a little stricter than what we may have under shoreland zoning. Because shoreland zoning, it does allow a buffer area to be mowed a minimum of twice a year.
Yeah.
But that, usually those are in cases where the buffer area is a grass buffer area.
A maximum of twice a year.
Maximum, yeah. Did I say minimum? I meant maximum, yeah.
Maximum is the word.
Yeah, maximum's the word, yeah. But ideally for a buffer, what works the best is a tree canopy, and we specify, like in shoreland zoning, no openings greater than 250 square feet, and the development over time of a duff layer. A combination of those two items makes an excellent buffer.
Can you tell me what an opening is?
An opening
Are
in
any of these
that,
people that have lawns to the water, are they grandfathered, if it's been there for 80, 90 years?
oh yeah, this is for new development.
That's what I thought, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, it's a term of art.
Well, they've been since the ordinance, when you say 80 or 90 years, this, 2005, people, new owners of property, and then continued the way the property was handled before, and so with a change of ownership or something,
No, this would be something they would, no, the change of ownership wouldn't trigger these standards.
so only if someone bought the place, took down a house, and was building new,
That's correct.
These things are a perspective in effect only.
Yeah.
To start designing in a buffer layer in your landscape plan?
That's correct, yes. Yeah, just to answer your question on the 250-foot opening, it's difficult to do, and which,
I mean, in theory, I guess that would be a circle that's 250 square feet, and I did some math, and it's pretty small.
it's a pretty small area, yeah. What we're looking for is, and we do this with shoreland zoning, I have done it for 30 years, we're really looking, and this really comes into play when people remove trees or diseased trees. We're looking that we don't have large areas. And the other thing we look for is what kind of growth is on the ground. We look for a duff area, and we look for a healthy shrub development on that.
I mean, I think it would seem to me, just as a layperson, the canopy affects the amount of sunlight
Yeah.
that gets to the ground.
Promotes
But
new
the
growth.
important thing is the duff.
Yeah, and what happens is over time, as more sunlight,
Right.
we get a higher growth rate, and then it fills in.
And
Yeah,
it's the vegetation that absorbs the,
that's right, yeah.
okay.
Yeah, but it's difficult to,
But,
we don't go out there with a measuring stick, it's just impossible to. I'm sorry,
one other comment, if I could, about the 2,000 gallon. The standard is very, very nice because it's a pro forma, but if someone really, watered their lawn during the summer, they could easily at 3 gallons a minute exceed the 2,000 gallons a day just by watering their lawn. They have a big lawn. So I think it's a very lenient standard. I'm not saying to change it. I'm just saying the difference between pro forma and what people actually do could be a variance. And it'd be very almost impossible to detect.
well, I think what we're looking at, Freeman, is the normal occurrence is 2,000 gallons per day. I mean, obviously, if someone filled up their pool, they may draw a significant amount of water, but it wouldn't be a regular occurrence.
But I agree, but I'm saying right now, if you have a lot of lawn, you're watering this drought, you're using a lot of water.
Yeah. And we don't, I mean, unless we're in a drought situation where we restrict, yeah.
Are we?
No, not yet.
Oh, yeah?
We're
So-
starting. Anyway, it's a small number.
Has the town ever gotten entangled in a "you've made my well run dry" debate?
Oh, I'm sure, yeah, that happens. I mean, most of the time, the problems occur, or most recently, we're getting problems with saltwater incursion along the coast. And some of that's some of that has to do with density of development in certain areas, but also as the ocean water rises, there's pressure and differences, and it forces more salt water into these wells that are closer to the ocean. So that's where we're having issues. But occasionally, in some developments, somebody might put a well and it's just adversely affects the vein that your well is, connected to, and there can be problems, yeah. That does happen, it's not.
Nothing we're addressing here.
No, that is something that's handled on a case-by-case basis with the well drillers and the property owners. Is there anything else?
I got just a couple of typos.
Sure.
Max, on 81124, clearing of dead and diseased trees may.
May.
Right, and then the little chart underneath, the average slope of land between, and I think that should say disturbed.
Not
areas,
distributed,
not
yeah.
distributed.
Disturbed area.
So, Bill, sorry, back up, I seem to have missed something. The buffer requirements for water quality protection, is this all kinds of water? Not just, the ponds, it's
No.
streams and rivers and
Yep,
everything?
Yeah, it says adjacent, including wetlands containing open water, streams, rivers, ponds, and coastal waters.
Yeah, you got it right there, I got it, thanks.
And that is enforced. If you have regional land, you've got to get wetland mapping first thing. Sometimes you can wait by it to make sure you understand what you can and can't do.
Right. And that's where the beginning with habitat maps are invaluable, because you could quickly see, if there's wetlands on your property or adjacent to them.
Okay.
We're at the end of the environmental section. So for next time, we're going to do the specific performance standards. There's a lot there in those, and we'll get those out within a couple of days, but many of them are not changing. So we'll highlight the ones or let you know which ones have been revised. There's certain things like manufacturing.
As you say, highlighting, are you barring down the side, or are you using?
No, we're just
How are you communicating?
we're just going to let you know which sections were changed. There's only going to be 4 or 5 sections that are changed.
Are we adding any new standards for the new uses that we're adding into the book?
Yes, we are, yeah. Yeah, and those will identify, yeah. But things, we have to make some changes to the communication tower or a section relative to some changes in the federal standards. And also, there's certain things like the manufactured housing standards haven't changed. I'm trying to think. The cluster housing section hasn't changed. So there's some things there that, that take up a lot, that are lengthy performance standards that we're not really touching. But it's worthwhile to go through them again. So that section's going to take us a little more time.
That's the next meeting?
That's the next meeting.
That's the first Monday in July, right?
Yep.
Yep.
That'll be
July 13th.
July 13th.
At 6 p.m.
It was very much appreciated that you sent out a reminder a couple hours ago. That's why I'm here.
Me too.
Yeah, we'll do the same thing.
Probably do the same thing.
That's a good
Yeah.
plus.
Max is in habit of doing that on all the Zoom meetings. They're easy to,
Max is on the ball.
Because everyone always asks where the link is the day of the meeting.
and we'll also send out the link to the LID standards so you can take a look at them.
So is there anything else we need to do other than look for a motion to adjourn?
No?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I'm going to hit the leave the meeting button.
Yeah.
Good job, George.
Well, yes.
Big